The fires in the village spread wider, casting the night in shifting red light and thick smoke. The fighters shouted to one another, their voices edged with panic, as the unseen sniper cut them down one by one. Maren pressed her body low behind the collapsed wall, her rifle steady, her eyes scanning for the leader again. She knew the balance of the fight depended on breaking him, but his men guarded him closely, weaving through the chaos like wolves shielding their alpha. The SEALs remained bound. Near the fire, their faces streaked with sweat, their bodies tense. One of them caught her movement in the shadows, their eyes locking across the distance, his gaze sharp and unflinching, as though he recognized something in the calm of her stare, though he could not yet know who she was. He nodded ever so slightly, as if acknowledging an ally in the chaos. And Maren felt the silent weight of their hope pressing against her. Gunfire cracked across the night bullets, slicing through the hut splinters. Raining down near her face, the fighters had closed the circle, hunting her through the flames, their torches swinging like wild lanterns. Maren drew her blade as she slipped from the cover, moving soundlessly toward the nearest alley. A fighter lunged into her path, his rifle raised, but she struck before he could fire, the blade sharp and quick, his body falling into the dust as she dragged him into shadow. The shouts grew louder, men calling out the loss of another guard, rifles rattling in blind. Bursts across the huts, Maren slipped further inside the maze of smoke, her lungs burning with the heat. Each breath thick and heavy, she wiped the sweat from her brow and steadied her hands again. She thought of the SEALs bound and waiting there, strength trapped by rope, their eyes still searching the darkness for a way out, and she promised herself she would cut those ropes no matter the cost. She reached the outer ring of guards where two fighters stood, with rifles at the ready, their eyes sharp scanning every flicker of shadow. Maren crouched behind a pile of crates, her rifle dismantled and tucked away. Her hands gripping the hilt of her blade, she waited for the gap, the single moment when their attention split. One stepped aside to light a cigarette, and in that breath she struck from behind, her blade swift, her body low, her silence absolute, as one man collapsed before the other realized what was happening. The second fighter turned, his rifle lifting, but her hand shot up, grabbing the barrel, forcing it aside as the shot exploded into the dirt. She twisted the weapon away, driving her knee into his chest, the force sending him crashing back against the crates. She pressed the blade to his throat, silencing him before he could call out, her pulse hammering, yet her movements smooth her body. Remembering every drill, every lesson from years ago, she pulled the weapon into her own hands and melted back into the smoke. She was close now, the prisoners only yards away, the fighters still clustered in confusion around their leader, who barked furious commands, his men scrambling to obey, his scarred face lit by the glow of fire, his eyes wild with rage. Maren steadied herself, rifle raised once more, but before she could fire, the leader yanked one of the SEALs to his knees, pressing a pistol to the soldier's head, shouting for the ghost in the shadows to reveal herself or watch him die. The air seemed to freeze. The fighters went silent, the fire crackling. The only sound, Maren's heart pounded as she stared through her scope, the leader's finger resting on the trigger. The SEAL on his knees, his jaw clenched, his eyes steady, as though he accepted what was to come. She knew if she hesitated a heartbeat longer, he would fall and the mission would collapse with him. Yet the shot was risky, the angle narrow, the chance of failure unbearable. She breathed deep, slowing her pulse, remembering the calm she had once been taught, that in the storm only stillness could guide the strike. Her crosshairs steady, her finger curling on the trigger as the leader screamed into the night, demanding her surrender. Her lips tightened as she whispered a single word to herself. Then she pulled the trigger, and the pistol fell from his hand as the man staggered back. His grip broken by the shot, chaos erupted again. Fighters rushing to shield their leader, shouting in confusion as the SEAL on his knees twisted away, throwing his shoulder into the guard beside him. The prisoners surged with sudden force. Their bonds strained, but their discipline fierce even bound. They moved as one bodies crashing against their captors. The fighters struggled to contain them, the circle broken in an instant by the precision of her shot and the fury of soldiers unwilling to surrender. Marin moved quickly. Her rifle slung her blade flashing as she cut through the last shadows. Her breath ragged, the smoke thick, her eyes locked on the prisoners still bound, but now fighting. With everything they had, she knew she had only moments before the fighters regained control, and she was determined to reach them before that moment came. The fire roared higher, the village shaking with shouts and gunfire, the storm at its peak, and Marin pushed forward knowing the final step was near, but also knowing that with every second the danger pressed closer around her and the fight had only begun. Marin burst from the smoke, her blade cutting through the rope that bound the first seal, his wrists snapping free as he caught the falling weapon from her hand. His eyes fierce and filled with sudden fire. The others turned toward her, their bonds straining as the flames rose behind them, her movements precise. Her breath ragged, yet her focus sharper than ever. She knew this was the only chance to shift the tide. The leader stumbled, clutching his injured hand, his eyes burning with hatred as he roared for his men to hold the line. The fighters surged forward, their rifles cracking. Through the night, their boots pounding the dirt as the smoke swirled around them. Marin dropped low, pulling another seal to his feet, his muscles trembling with exhaustion, yet his spirit unbroken together. They moved like wolves breaking free from a cage. The clash in the center of the burning village erupted into chaos, fists striking rifles, firing men grappling in the dust and smoke. Marin spun through the melee, each movement a memory of countless drills, her blade flashing her eyes never, leaving the scarred leader who rallied his men with rage. The seals, though weakened by captivity, moved with raw discipline, turning broken branches and captured rifles into weapons of their own, as though they had trained for this very moment. The flames illuminated the desperation on every face, shadows leaping against the broken walls. The villagers who had been hiding now peered from the edges, their eyes wide as the fight raged before them. They saw a woman standing alone against a wave of armed men, her figure unshaken, her resolve unbroken. The whispers carried in the smoke, a ghost, a shadow, a savior come from nowhere. Marin pressed forward, closing the distance between herself and the leader, her rifle lifted once more, but his men swarmed around him, forming a living wall, their shouts echoing through the burning huts. He raised his pistol again, his wounded hand shaking, yet his finger locked with fury. He aimed not at her, but at the seal nearest him, forcing her to choose between her target and the lives she swore to save. The decision carved itself in a heartbeat. Her shot rang out, the guard collapsing into the dust, the pistol veering away, the seal diving for cover as the wall of fighters cracked open for a single instant. Marin charged through, blade in hand, her boots striking the dirt, her eyes locked on the scarred face before her. He turned just in time to see the fury in her gaze. Their struggle clashed in the center of the fire, his strength brute and furious, her precision sharp and relentless. His fist crashed against her arm, forcing her blade wide. Her knee drove upward, breaking his stance. They fell together into the dirt, grappling for control, the seals still bound, but rising behind them, their voices shouting as the fighters faltered in confusion, watching their leader locked in combat with the ghost they could not defeat. The ground trembled with their struggle, his hand clawing for her rifle, her grip unyielding, the smoke stinging her eyes. She remembered the silence of her training, the calm before the storm. She let the fury settle into stillness. Her movement, a single fluid strike, the blade flashing across the night, his body stiffening. His roar, turning into silence, the fire reflecting in his eyes before he collapsed into the dust. The fighters froze, shock spreading across their faces, the weight of their leader's fall, breaking their spirit. The seals seized the moment, surging forward, ropes snapping under blades, their voices rising. In a roar of defiance, they struck with sudden freedom, each movement fueled by rage and relief. Marin rose to her feet, chest heaving, blade dripping smoke curling around her, as the men who had once mocked the ghost now faced the truth of her strength. Some fighters fled into the darkness, abandoning weapons and torches. Others stood frozen, their courage shattered by the fall of the man they feared most. The villagers stepped cautiously from their hiding places, whispering with disbelief, their eyes on the woman who stood with the seals, their voices carrying the story even as it was written in the fire and the dust. A woman alone had broken the circle and the night itself. The night air grew heavier as Marin pressed deeper into the outer ring of the village, her boots brushing softly against the sand. Her ears sharp to every sound, the fire crackled from the center where most of the fighters gathered their voices. Rough and careless as they boasted of victory, and mocked the captured seals. She used the cover of shadows slipping between huts, her blade gleaming faintly in the starlight, as her eyes fixed on the next guard, standing alone at the edge of a narrow alley. The man leaned lazily against the wall, his weapon resting carelessly by his side, his gaze fixed toward the firelight, unaware of the silence growing behind him. Marin moved like breath itself, her steps deliberate, her heartbeat calm, though. The blood in her veins surged hot. She closed the gap, her hand swift and sure, the blade finding its mark. Before he could draw a breath, his body collapsed softly, and she pulled him into the shadows, where the night swallowed him whole. Her eyes darted upward, the torches at the edge of the huts flickering, casting long, uneven shadows across the dirt paths. Every flicker threatened to expose her. Every sound pressed her nerves tight. She breathed slow, steady, reminding herself that patience was survival. Her hands wiped clean, her grip firm on the weapon she had carried through other nights long ago. Nights she had sworn she left behind, but now had returned with sharper purpose. The seals sat in the center, bound at the wrists, their eyes flickering. In the firelight, Marin studied their faces through the slats of a hut she had crouched behind. They looked battered but alive, their shoulders tense, their jaws tight as if willing themselves not to break. She saw the youngest of them, his lips split, his head bowed as if in prayer, while another leaned close, whispering words too faint to hear. She knew they were clinging to discipline, to hope, though surrounded by 50 fighters who believed the night was theirs. She counted again, her eyes moving, from face to face, weapons glinting in the light. She mapped the positions of each fighter, the way they shifted their stances, the rhythm of their patrols, 2 circling clockwise, 2 counterclockwise, 1 always leaning near the prisoners, their rifles angled in lazy confidence as though nothing could break the circle. Marin memorized each step, every pause, every careless glance, because those details would be the keys to shattering the circle. She slipped behind another hut, her body pressed low, her breath shallow as footsteps scraped against the dirt. Nearby, a fighter strode past, humming tunelessly, his rifle slung across his back. Marin waited, her muscles tight, coiled, as if every second would snap her resolve. Then, with a swift motion, she reached upward, dragging him into the dark, her blade cutting off the sound of his voice. His body folded against the wall, her eyes narrowing as she realized she was erasing their numbers one by one, but each move carried greater risk. The bodies. Though hidden might be found, the missing patrolman might draw suspicion. And time was not her ally. She needed to act before dawn, before the enemy began to question the silence at their edges. Her plan had to unfold quickly, precise, like the snap of her scissors in the base salon, each cut exact, each motion deliberate. She told herself she was not just rescuing the seals. She was reclaiming the person she had always been before she chose to hide in plain sight. A howl pierced the night. Sudden, sharp from the hills beyond the village, the fighters turned their heads briefly, some laughing, some muttering about wolves. The distraction gave her a moment, and she used it, slipping closer toward the center, her eyes locked on the prisoners who now shifted ever so slightly. One of them lifting his head, his gaze scanning the darkness as though he sensed the presence watching him from the shadows. Marin froze, her breath. Held the seal had seen something in the blackness. His eyes narrowed, his body tensed. She could almost feel his question, though no words passed between them. She willed him to remain still, to keep his silence, to wait for what was coming, because the night was about to break open. And with it, the thin line between survival and death would shatter. Her knife returned to its sheath, her hand reaching for the compact rifle she had assembled earlier. The metal cold steady beneath her grip, she crouched low, raising the scope to her eye. Her breath slow as her crosshairs. Lined on the first guard nearest the prisoners, the torchlight flickered across his chest, his rifle hanging lazily, his smile smug. She steadied her finger against the trigger, whispering to herself that this was the moment that would change everything. The silence of the desert seemed to deepen around her, her breath and heartbeat. The only rhythm in her ears, she squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot ripped the night open. The guard dropped instantly, his body crashing to the ground. The fighters whipped their heads in panic. The SEALs jerked upright eyes wide as the village exploded into chaos and Marin melted deeper into the shadows, her rifle already swinging to find the next target as the storm she had unleashed began to roar. The first shot echoed through the valley, carrying far beyond the village, and the air filled with shouts as the fighters scrambled for their weapons. Marin stayed low, her rifle steady, her eyes sharp as she marked the second target, a man rushing toward the prisoners, his finger curling on the trigger. She exhaled slow and squeezed another shot, tearing through the silence, and the fighter collapsed inches away from the SEALs, who now looked around with disbelief. Chaos rippled through the enemy ranks. Men shouting orders in a language Marin had studied long ago, their voices frantic, their discipline crumbling under the sudden unseen assault. They fired wildly into the darkness, bullets cutting through huts and scattering sparks into the night. But none of them knew where the threat lay. Their confusion bought her precious seconds, and she moved swiftly to another position, crawling along the edge of a broken wall as firelight danced against her face. The SEALs pressed low, their eyes scanning. The shadows, one of them lifting his head to catch a glimpse of the direction of the shots, his expression unreadable, yet his posture shifting as though strength had returned to him. The fighters argued loudly, some pointing toward the ridge, others toward the huts. And in their disarray they left gaps in their formation, gaps that Marin saw instantly, gaps that she could tear wider if she struck again. She adjusted her rifle, lined her scope on a cluster of men moving hastily toward the prisoners. She waited, letting their careless steps close the distance, then released another shot that cut one down and scattered the rest into confusion. Her heartbeat steady, even as adrenaline surged through her. She whispered to herself, counting each target. Not as a victory, but as a necessity, because every second mattered and the SEALs' lives hung in the balance. The fighters began firing toward the ridges, searching for a sniper on the high ground. None of them imagined the shots were coming from inside, the very walls of their village. Marin shifted again, slipping deeper into the maze of huts, her boots silent, her breath measured. She reloaded quickly, each movement fluid like a drill. She had never forgotten. She could hear the men shouting ever, louder now, their panic clear, though their numbers still heavy and unbroken. One fighter stumbled across the body. Marin had left hidden in the shadows. His cry raised the alarm, and suddenly the noise of search spread through the campmen rushing. Into alleys, rifles aimed torches, swinging wildly. The flames cast long shadows across the dirt, and smoke filled the air as huts caught fire from stray bullets. The village transformed into a storm of fear and flame, and Marin felt the noose of danger tightening around her. She pressed against a wall, the heat from the burning hut warming her back. Her eyes darting to the prisoners who had lifted their heads, their eyes searching the chaos. She knew they were trained to seize any chance, and though bound, they were waiting for the crack in the enemy line that only she could give them. Her pulse quickened as she realized the next steps would decide everything. A torch swung close, footsteps pounding against the earth. A fighter passed within inches. Of her, his rifle raised, his eyes scanning furiously. Maren held still, her hand tight around her blade until he turned his head and moved away. She slipped from the wall, her breath sharp, her eyes fixed on the center, her instincts whispering that the time for the shadows was ending and the storm would soon break into open battle. The fighters regrouped near the prisoners, their leader shouting, his voice rising above the fire. He barked orders, his face twisted with rage, pointing toward the ridges, demanding his men spread out. Maren caught sight of him clearly for the first time, a tall figure scarred across his cheek, his rifle gleaming in the light. He was the anchor of their force, and she knew if he fell, the rest might shatter like glass under a hammer. She crouched low, lifted her rifle again, her scope finding his chest steady against the torchlight. She held her breath, finger tightening on the trigger, when a sudden burst of gunfire struck the wall inches from her head. Dust. Exploding into her eyes, she rolled aside, heart pounding the shot. Lost the leader, ducked, shouting louder than before as his men fanned out, hunting the ghost that stalked them in the night. The base was quiet under the desert sun, its walls thick with dust, and its halls humming with the faint echo of daily routine among the soldiers moving through with purpose. There was one woman who seemed out of place. Her name was Maren. She was the base hairdresser, known for her steady hands, her warm smile, and her scissors that clicked rhythmically through the day. The men teased her, called her the one who knew more gossip than the radio operators, but she laughed it off because none of them ever guessed the truth she kept hidden. Behind the small salon chair where she trimmed and shaped the hair of men who carried rifles heavier than her arms, Maren listened. She listened to their chatter, their frustrations, their stories, and she picked up more about the state of the missions than any briefing room. She worked quietly with scissors in hand, yet her mind was sharper than the steel she wielded. And though the soldiers thought she was there only to keep them looking sharp, she carried a history she never revealed. Years ago, before she was the hairdresser, before she wore civilian clothes, on a military base she had trained. She had endured harsh weeks in the wilderness, the biting cold of nights without fire, and the cracking sound of gunfire over her head. She had not worn the badge of a soldier, but she had stood in the same mud as them, her skills forged in a program that most civilians never heard of, a program designed to create assets that could be placed anywhere unseen. She had left that life behind, but that life never left her. She moved through her days unnoticed, blending into the background of the base as if invisible. The men treated her kindly, but never seriously, for they thought she was nothing more than comfort and normalcy in a place that had little of either. She smiled when they laughed, she offered a listening ear when they spoke, but when she was alone in her small quarters, she still practiced routines, muscle memory drills, and the feel of cold metal against her palm because something inside her told her she might one day need it again. That day arrived without warning. The morning sun had barely touched the horizon. When news came the SEAL team on a covert mission had been captured, dragged into a remote village, held at gunpoint by more than 50 fighters. The base went into chaos, men shouting orders, radios crackling with broken fragments of transmission. The commander slammed his fist on the table while the others scrambled to make sense of how to rescue the men before it was too late. Maren sat in her salon chair, her scissors resting silent in her lap as the words sank in. She saw the faces of those men she had cut hair for just days before, the ones who teased her about her steady hands, the ones who never thought they would be caught off guard. Now they were surrounded, stripped of their weapons, and facing an enemy that outnumbered them, and for the first time in years, Maren felt the old instincts stirring inside her. She rose quietly from her seat, unnoticed by the frantic soldiers rushing to and from the command room. She walked back to her quarters, each step steady, deliberate, her pulse quickening. She opened the footlocker beneath her bed, and inside lay the tools of a life she had sworn she would never return to, a set of carefully wrapped gear small enough to pass unnoticed, deadly enough to shift the balance of a fight. She touched them slowly, as if greeting old friends long forgotten. Her fingers lingered on a single item, a worn leather grip cold and heavy in her hand. She had carried it once across borders where her name was never spoken aloud. She closed her eyes, remembering the drills, the targets, the moments when seconds decided life or death. And though she had tried to live as nothing more than a base hairdresser, she knew the time for hiding was over. She whispered to herself that some debts could not be ignored, and the faces of the captured SEALs burned bright. In her memory, as the sun climbed higher over the desert, Marin stood at the threshold of her small room, her gear hidden beneath the folds of a plain bag, the soldiers outside still shouting into radios, still searching for answers that seemed impossible. She slipped into the hallway unnoticed, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with certainty, because she alone knew what had to be done, and though no one expected it, she was already moving toward the storm where 52 fighters held the SEALs, in chains, and the real test was only beginning. Do you want me to continue straight into part 2? Another 800 words, no punctuation marks with suspense endings, so the story flows seamlessly? The desert stretched wide and merciless the heat, rippling in waves as Marin moved away from the base, her boots crunching softly over the brittle ground she carried, nothing that would draw suspicion. A simple bag slung over her shoulder, her figure blending with the emptiness around her. The men at the gates assumed she was headed toward the market that civilians often visited. No one asked questions and no one would know what she carried within that plain bag. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon where distant mountains carved a jagged line against the sky. She remembered the map she had once studied, the villages marked with careful precision, the radio chatter that spoke of fighters gathering in numbers greater than the patrols could face. She knew the SEALs were being held in one of those villages, and every step she took tightened the knot in her stomach. Though her face remained calm, her mind played through the possible routes of approach and the dangers waiting ahead. By midday, the sun was merciless, burning into her. Skin the sweat dampening her shirt as she found shelter under a broken ridge, she pulled the bag closer, unwrapping the gear piece by piece. A compact rifle dismantled into sections, a small set of blades worn but sharp, and a folded scope still precise. Despite the years untouched, she laid them out across the sand, her fingers steady as if she had never stopped practicing. The rhythm of her hands was automatic, like a song her body remembered. Though her heart thudded heavy with what was to come, he thought of the SEALs, their faces, their voices in her little salon chair. Men who once joked about her scissors, about her not being able to hold a rifle as steady as they could. She smiled bitterly at the memory, because now their survival might depend entirely on her hands, she whispered under her breath. Words she had not spoken in years, the call signs, the signals drilled into her bones, and with each whisper she felt the ranger within her awakening. As evening drew closer, she climbed higher. Along the ridge, using the rocks to mask her shape, she spotted smoke rising from a cluster of huts in the valley below. Through her scope, she could see the fighters, their weapons slung casually over their shoulders, the arrogance of men who believed they had already won. She counted them one by one until she reached 52, the weight of the number pressing down on her. But then her scope caught something else that made her heart clench. The SEALs were bound near the center of the village. Their hands tied, their faces bruised, but their posture still proud. Even in chains they did not speak, but their eyes betrayed the exhaustion of men who had fought until they could no longer resist. They were surrounded by guards armed and watchful, their rifles never far from reach, and Marin knew any direct assault would mean the men would die before help could arrive. She pulled back from the scope, her chest rising and falling as the plan began to take shape in her mind. It was risky. It was nearly impossible. But it was the only way she could see a way to shift the balance she would have, to move silently under the cover of night, cutting the edges of the enemy line, sowing chaos before they realized where the attack was coming from. And only then could the SEALs have a chance to fight. Free night descended. slowly shadows stretching long across the valley, the fires of the village glowing brighter as laughter and voices echoed upward. Marin tightened the straps of her gear. Breath controlled her hands steady. She whispered again, the call signs of her past. The reminder that she had once been forged for nights exactly like this, and though she had hidden as a hairdresser for years, the soldier within her was alive again. She descended from the ridge as the first stars pierced the sky, her body close to the earth, her movement silent. Each footstep placed with deliberate care, the village loomed closer, every flicker of firelight revealing the silhouettes of men with rifles slung casually across their shoulders. Her pulse quickened, but her face remained expressionless. She slipped into the outer ring of huts, her knife already drawn, her eyes locked on the first sentry who stood with his back to her, unaware that the shadows were shifting. She closed the distance in a breath, her hand striking swift and precise. The man fell silently, his rifle slipping into the dust. She dragged his body into the shadows, her heart hammering, yet her hands steady. She knew the first step was always the hardest, and with it completed, there was no turning back, not tonight, not with 51 more fighters between her and the captured SEALs.